Welcome to the K-State Region Ag Pod, where we talk all things regenerative agriculture here at Kansas State University, across the state of Kansas and beyond. I'm Nick Detter, your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jerry Hatfield. Dr. Hatfield served as the laboratory director at the USDA's National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment in Ames, Iowa, for over 30 years between 1989 and 2020. He was inducted into the USDA Agricultural Research Service Hall of Fame in 2014, authored or co-authored 493 peer-reviewed publications, and happens to be a K-State Agronomy alum. He joins me to discuss his career and share his unique and valuable perspective on regenerative agriculture. Dr. Hatfield, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure, Nick. It's always great to be on this with you and everything and talk about regenerative ag, which has really become a pretty big passion of mine since I retired in 2020. So, and looking forward to this. So,
Yeah, well, how about you just to start off, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and that career that you've had, and maybe even some of the stuff you've been working on since you retired.
sure. Um, actually, just for everybody, I grew up on a farm just south of Wamego, on just off of Highway 99. My brother-in-law and sister still farm that farm, so I've been helping them over the past few years work transition that farm into all rotational grazing with a cow-calf operation. So we get back to eastern Kansas quite often and everything. We were just there this week. Um, like Nick said, I am a graduate of K-State in 1971 in agronomy. Got my master's from the University of Kentucky uh, in agronomy and crop physiology, and then I went to Iowa State where I got my PhD in agricultural climatology and meteorology with a minor in statistics and everything. So have worked across the whole Midwest on a number of different things. My first job was actually at University of California at Davis. I was a biometeorologist from 1975 to 1983, working on a variety of crops. I mean, California has a wide variety you can work on, so I worked on everything from strawberries to grapes to cotton and wheat, cit- citrus crops, and everything else across that. And in 1983, I left UC Davis and went to Lubbock, Texas to join USDA ARS as the research leader of the Plant Stress and Water Conservation Unit. So if you people doubted my sanity when I left UC Davis to go to Lubbock, Texas. But if you want to do plant stress, Lubbock's a pretty good place to do it. I mean, you can have water, you can have wind, you can have all sorts of different stresses out there. And in 1989, USDA transferred me from Lubbock to Ames to open up the National Soil Tilth Lab. It was a new laboratory, at least a building, but it didn't have a program. So my job there was to build a research program. And so there I stayed from 1989 to 2020 when I retired, working on a number of different things. And you notice we changed the name of the lab to the National Lab for Ag and the Environment in about 1996 um, for a number of different reasons, but our lab really focused on what was the impact of agriculture on the environment, but also the impact of the environment on agriculture. So uh, that that career took me through a lot of different things, working on everything from water quality to soil health. And since I retired, uh, I've been spending a lot of time looking at how do we help producers do a better job of understanding this linkage between the soil and the plant and the atmosphere. The concept that we work on is G by E by M, genetics by environment by management, because management is what the producers spend their time thinking about. Environment's what they're trying to overcome, either the weather or the soil changes in their fields, because genetics is what they're trying to optimize. And so when you start looking at that concept and working with them, they begin to understand the role that their management decisions plays in all these different pieces that are out there. So it become quite exciting. uh, from that standpoint. So done everything from soil health in cultivated systems to working on rotational grazing systems and regenerative ag, and maybe a little different perspective to really figure out the value of livestock and what we can do in those systems as well. So.
Yeah, it's such a broad career, and I'm just excited to get to hear all your perspective on things because you have dabbled in all those kind of different geographies and cropping systems, and so really grateful that we get to have you on today. Before we dive into your research, though, I think you're actually our first guest we've had on that's affiliated with ARS, that has had experience with ARS, and just so for our audience can know, could you maybe give a little bit about the history and the mission of ARS, what it is, and kind of how it evolved in your time with the agency.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of people is within USDA often refer to Agricultural Research Service as probably the best kept secret in USDA. Everybody knows USDA from two programs, and maybe three. One is NRCS, where producers go for a lot of their information on conservation planning. FSA, where they go for their support payments. And then we've got, and then the whole SNAP program and all the food assistant programs. But then there's a couple uh, little hidden agencies in there. The Economic Research Service, which looks at a lot of the different pieces of what the economic impact of agriculture is, and then the Agriculture Research Service, which is mandated to really look at how do you conduct agricultural research in benefit of American agriculture. And it has programs that go all the way from animal science to food science and food nutrition to crop production and crop protection. Those are the three broad areas within ARS. There's multiple locations across the United States. Um, there's been a wind erosion unit in Manhattan that's been combined with other places right now. Um, Everybody's quite familiar with the APHIS lab that is in Manhattan right now in terms of looking at that biological safety of agriculture. Um, I happen to direct one of the national labs in Ames for, like Nick said, for 32 years, looking at that. And we've got a number of other locations that are really quite specialized in looking at particular problems relative to that production area as well. So, I mean, it's really look at a lot of this. We link back and forth. A lot of the ARS locations are co-located with universities.
Mm.
And so there's a strong partnership between land grant universities and ARS in conducting that, all the different pieces, because one of the advantages that ARS has is that we're a base funded organization, so we can take on long-term experiments, set those up. One of the flagship programs right now that I think would be a benefit and interest to a lot of listeners is the LTAR program, the long-term agricultural ecological research sites. Those are much more of a watershed based program to look at how do land management systems interface with environmental quality and now production aspects, and now linking it into economics as well. So there's a linkage of all these different pieces going on in terms of how do we begin to develop systems that can benefit uh, the producer directly and everything else. So.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good transition into my next question about some of your specific research. And a lot of your research focused on the benefits of regenerative agricultural practices on hydrological systems. So could you maybe highlight some of those benefits? And then I have one other follow-up question with that is, in your research, were you finding that the benefits were specifically linked to specific practices, such as no-till or cover crops, or was it more of the system as a whole that was deriving those benefits?
Yeah, let me I'll back up just a little bit, Nick, in terms of this, because why this interest between regenerative agriculture and eco-hydrology, or the hydrology part of the systems, because my whole career has been based on looking at water use efficiency. How do you get that cropping systems and even perennial ag systems, trees and everything else, and now range, and getting the most production per unit of water that's out there. And so when we start looking at water use efficiency and water use by crops is that we know that the increased productivity comes from the ability of that crop to transpire more water coming out. So it's been kind of a natural progression over my career to start looking at all this and saying, what can we do within the soil to improve water availability? Uh, how can we begin to look at this system from an entirely different perspective? And so, excuse me, when you think about um, this whole dynamic of regenerative agriculture, um, in some cases there are specific practices, in other cases that's the system. I'll give you a specific example. If we just add additional cover. Like a cover crop or even residue out there, we do a couple things because I can change the water balance immediately adding residue or a cover crop out there because I'm intercepting all the raindrop energy by that crop and then it slowly moves into the soil. So I increase my infiltration rate. Once I increase my infiltration rate, I no longer have that pounding rainfall directly on the soil surface, so I reduce erosion. The other piece is I also reduce the evaporation component. And we see those things occur in a lot of this. Systems, whether they be in humid areas or the dry areas and everything else, the more dry we get, the problem we have is being able to get enough residue to protect that soil surface. So we've been looking at saying just how much residue does it take? The experiments that we have ongoing in eastern Colorado, where we're talking about 10 to 12 inches of rain, looking and saying, doesn't take a whole lot of residue, particularly if you can keep it standing, to change that whole hydrologic balance and everything else. And so that's that's been the piece of this puzzle that you look at it. So you start looking and saying, how do you maintain that residue out there? But also we know we've got to get that crop in the ground. So how do you incorporate either planting tillage or fertilizer input into that system that doesn't totally disrupt that and everything. I do come from the Iowas right now and everything else, so we'd love to have black ground in the spring, but we see a lot of erosion coming out of that as well. So, we're really trying to work on how do we utilize things like strip tillage to only till a certain area that maintain that residue across that system to be able to help it from that standpoint. So, not only do we change the water balance, we also change the temperature dynamics of this because if we have bare soil between rows of crops, say we have a 30-inch corn crop, bare soil in between, um, we can get soil temperatures at the surface that are 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And at 1 or 2 inches, we're well above 100 degrees. And so it means we're denaturing protein. We're basically what I tell producers is you're cooking the life out of your soil. So once we put that residue on there, our soil temperatures go to a maybe upper 80s and everything else, which is right in the sweet spot for all those fungi and bacteria to do their thing in terms of improving that soil over time. So,
Well, are there other research findings kind of beyond your work with hydrological systems that you'd like to highlight for the audience?
yeah, I mean, if you start looking at this, I mean, now we move from a field to a complete watershed. How do we look at the water quality pieces of this? Just interfacing with the RAPS program that you have in Kansas on some of those different watersheds out there. How do you put practices in place that improve water quality, but not only that, but keep that water retained on that field so that we're improving that. But what does escape is pretty clean water, where we've had, and producers are beginning to observe this for themselves when they have residue and cover crops out there, they may have runoff off that field, but they'll go out and they'll take a bottle and look at that, and it'll be pretty clear water, and the neighbor's field that's tilled, it'll be pretty brown with the soil moving out. So they're seeing for themselves that they're not losing their soil and everything. So that's become a pretty interesting piece of this that producers are beginning to observe for themselves the value of these changes out there. The other piece of this is what crop rotations do you put in? Uh, Not only with the cover crops, because there's always a concern about, getting that cover crop planted, getting it terminated. Do I plant green? When do I terminate? And how all this, am I competing back and forth with the water resources that are out there, particularly as you move across Kansas, move from wet to drier Kansas. how much how much water is that cover crop using? What's the value coming back and forth? And that's been the age-old question that we've been looking at, is saying, well, you'd be better off diversifying your rotation uh, and everything, and looking at how you manage that crop from a different perspective, so that water goes into an economic crop as part of a more complex rotation and everything. So those are things that people have beginning to have questions about, and we're trying to understand just the overall dynamics.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, as we discover more things, there's always more questions that evolve. And I think that's, the the beauty and the challenge sometimes of agricultural research and agronomic systems. So I think my next question just is, based on your career and your knowledge and your experience, what are some of those lingering research questions, you feel like that have been left unanswered, or that you're hoping to see those gaps be addressed in ongoing research?
I told somebody this week, because we were on a farm tour across everything, that I'm surprised how much dumber I've got since I retired and everything. And part of that is it's not a flippant answer. It's the fact that really what we're talking about is understanding the interactions between a lot of different pieces, and probably one of the most complex interactions that I'm trying to tackle right now is what's the interaction between uh, carbon that we put into the soil, the water dynamics, and the nitrogen dynamics, all those different things. Because we know we have producers that say, well, if I improve my soil, I don't have to put as much nitrogen on. Well, is that due to the fact that we've increased the water availability and so the plant's more efficient in taking up water, and because of the changes in soil structure, are we making more nutrients really available, or is that plant more efficient in extracting what nutrients are there? And so we've been spending a lot of time lately on saying how much carbon is really going into that soil system by our cropping system. Uh, and if we can keep that carbon there, what's it do to feed it? It's because it's an energy source. What's it doing to feeding the biology? And the more that we can keep that biological system active throughout the year, we know we can have very positive changes in that soil. And so, I mean, I've got producers that have gone from 1% to 5% organic matter over about a 6-year period. I mean, it's phenomenal. I've got some that are up at 8% now in areas that were really poor soils. And I know they were poor soils because um, I worked those fields as a high school student for when I worked for a producer. So I know those fields pretty intimately. And to see them today, they're entirely different looking soils than what they were before. So it's fascinating to see those changes over time and what it means for their overall productivity of their system and everything else. So it that's probably the most lingering question is how do these things interact, and how
Mm,
can we put that into that management system so that a producer can say, well, if I do this, this might happen, or at least I, and the overall piece of this is how do we build these systems to reduce their risk?
mm,
Um, because we know there's going to be dry years and there's going to be wet years. I mean, that's inevitable because we've always had them and we're going to continue to have them. So, how do we begin to manage that water resource maybe a little bit more effectively than the way we've been doing? And put it into crop production so that they can begin to stabilize their yields as well. So, I mean, I'll just give you an anecdotal piece of this because um, worked with a producer in northern Iowa because he was very involved in looking at changes in the soil and everything else. And then I was talking about the the scientific basis for all this. So we would tag team on a lot of different programs. So one year I asked him, I said, "Would you be willing to share all of your data uh, since you begin to change your systems?" Uh, to do some very detailed analysis. So he gave me 18 years of yield monitored data across 10 fields, and we begun to look at it in an entirely different perspective by segregating those fields into different soil types within the field. And the fascinating piece of this, I mean, we did improve organic matter over time because we had the samples. But the biggest piece of this that I think surprised everyone is that as we begin to improve our organic matter, the variability within each of those soil types begin to decrease. Uh, so if you can take that low yielding part of that soil out, and even that field out, that's increased profitability. So we
mm,
were changing the overall distribution of yields, and we were making it tighter about the mean. And so all those different things that everybody wonders about, we began to see. And so as I've interacted with more producers that have changed their systems, they said, "Oh, yes, we're seeing greater uh, field response. We see less variability across that field. A number of different things that have happened that are beginning to change their whole idea of looking at this, but also seeing that we can improve the profitability within that field by simply changing the organic matter, getting more water availability, getting more efficient use of the nitrogen is going on within that because we were seeing a greater response of yield relative to nitrogen inputs. So those are fascinating things, and they're still lingering questions of how does this thing really work when we've got a biological system? Physics and chemistry is easy, biology is hard.
mm. Yeah, I know Dr. Rice's research has shown some of that same principle of like the uniformity across the field and the like you said the compression of the variability towards the mean. That's a fascinating one. I mean, it really does make you wonder, like well, like you said, what are some of the underlying principles kind of driving those interactions when we make these management changes? Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. So ARS kind of sits at an interesting nexus of research and policy because you're within the USDA. I mean, I actually had an interview a while back with someone from ERS, so kind of the economic research side of USDA, and we got to talking, and it really does sound like at times the part of the goal of the research, at least, is to help inform better policy
Right.
for agencies like NRCS or FSA, you know, who are more kind of maybe forward producer facing and making sure that the policies that they're working on or they're implementing with producers is informed on the best research. So I guess I was just curious if you felt like any of the research you were involved in influence policies at organizations like the NRCS, or maybe are there policy changes that you think going forward based off of what you've learned or the work you've even done after retirement, some of those things you just talked about, that you would like to see either private entities that are interested in regenerative agriculture to consider, or governmental agencies like the NRCS?
Yeah, I mean that's uh, earlier alluded to the LTAR program, the long-term agroecological research sites. That has become probably the biggest nexus between ARS and NRCS because NRCS a number of years ago was asked to actually show the economic value of conservation practices through a program called SEAP, Conservation Effects Assessment Program, uh, and to start looking at some hard economic numbers of this. Say, so what was conservation really worth? Not miles of terrace, not miles of waterway, but really what was the economic impact of that. Well, one of the things that came through from the LTAR program, when we start looking at the implementation of different conservation practices, including, say, no-till, strip-till, cover crops, and everything else, now we've got some hard numbers to say, here's really what the economic value of that is, and then also work with producers say, how do you really implement this in the most cost-effective way, and everything. So that's probably over the past 10 years, we've probably had much more uh, direct interaction between uh, FSA, NRCS, ARS, ERS, Economic Research Service, and how does all of this really begin to look at benefiting American agriculture much more directly, so that it's not just put into the FOTOG, which is the Field Office Technical Guide for NRCS, research publications, but saying, how do you implement this? And so a lot of the conservation innovation grants, the SIGs that are now approved, are much more focused on how do we how do we shorten that time interval between research, implementation and policy, and implementation back to a producer. So I'm excited about the direction that we're going, uh, in terms of being able to really show the benefit directly to agriculture producers, no matter what crop they're growing, or even livestock systems.
Mm. I think a slight follow-up with that is I know some of the folks that we have listening to this podcast are more from private companies that have interest in regenerative agriculture. And I guess just because I think you're a systems thinking guy, and I've had conversations with these folks, you see more food companies and even ag companies kind of take an interest in developing some kind of program to work with producers to promote or even financially incentivize regenerative agriculture. And I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on if a private organization was developing, programs around regenerative agriculture, what kind of things would you want them to be thinking about as they do that kind of work?
Well, and I think that where we see this in a lot of the say production companies, food companies, everything else, that now this emphasis on not only what we're producing, but the quality of that, I think is going to drive us for the next 5 or 10 years. And that's where I see a lot of the private companies now having a real interest in regenerative ag and saying, can I produce a higher quality product? And be able to label it. Uh, can I produce a higher quality meat coming out of animals that the producer or the consumer will be interested in? So I see this evolving public-private partnerships, particularly around quality pieces of this, because one of the things we do know and we've seen is if we improve our soils in terms of regenerative agriculture, is that we do improve the protein content of corn, uh, and even soybeans. So that if you directly put that into livestock, you know that we're reducing feed requirements because that the animal is more efficient in utilizing that. So people are beginning to understand that. Uh, I think now it translates that into the consumer. Ultimately, with this whole issue on human health, how does all these pieces play out? So I see that we're going to have much more dialogue about how these pieces fit together, and starting with regenerative ag, but ending up maybe looking at that product from a different perspective.
Absolutely. I think I've seen a lot of the same. That does seem to be where a lot of the energy is right now. Well, Jerry, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. And the last question I just like to ask all my guests is to kind of turn it back open over to them and let them talk about whatever they want to talk about. And the question I just ask is, what is something, one thing in your work or in your broader field that has you excited or optimistic?
Well, and I kind of transitioned from cultivated crops into rangeland now. I'm working on a rangeland product project where we're looking at supplying energy-based products to help that grass grow. But also, what we're seeing as we increase production of that grass, uh, because we've seen increases by as much as 500 to 1,500 pounds an acre. But we're also seeing a crude protein content of maybe 2 points. So that means you can really influence the stocking rates and everything. But at the same time, because we're putting more energy back into that soil, we're seeing a change in soil health characteristics. We see that change. We go from a more consolidated to a more blocky structure. We see that biology and evidence in changing soil aggregate size, infiltration rates, number of different things that happen in that. So I'm looking at the rangeland piece. Like I said, I'm working with my brother-in-law on how do we build a rotational grazing system so that we have year-round forage. So we're looking at combinations of crops that we put into that. So I got 500 acres of that I can experiment with him. He's very tolerant about working with us because we've seen, and just give you an example, if we uh, get great into a Sudan forage soybean mix, so we've got a higher protein forage for that. Um, Grazing that instead of baling it. I mean, we're seeing that we can change our profitability per acre by about $150 because we're not moving bales around. We're letting that cow. Then we're seeing that manure going back on really have an impact on that soil as well. So it's much more of a systems thinking approach. And how do we look at this? What combinations of crops do we use throughout the year to be able to look at some of that. So those are things that really excite me right now. How do we get agriculture much more efficient than where we're at? Um, the other piece of this, like I said, I'm working in eastern Colorado uh, with producers out there and saying, if we keep that standing residue, what do we have? Even though it may only be a 50 bushel sorghum crop, leaving that standing residue still influences the whole microclimate in that soil. We see tremendous reductions in evaporation. So make more efficient use of that water going on. So these are the things that continue to excite me uh, in terms of all of this because I think the future is bright for agriculture. But going back to a previous comment is that we need to understand some of these interactions that are going on. So what happens when we change biology and we add a little carbon, we add a little water, what happens to all the different nutrients that are going on in that overall system? So
Yeah, well, I agree that the future is bright, but there's a lot still to learn. But just before I let you go, I just wanted to clarify one thing. When you say energy products, what specifically are you referring to there?
basically molasses-based products. So we're adding some sugar, based in that, but we're adding some biologicals with it, and everything. Uh, and it's really, uh, we, it's really getting that energy into the system because we know that, a lot of our crops, are, the photosynthesis has a certain amount. We add that additional sugar going into that. A lot more of that gets transported right down to the root system that directly feeds that biology. And so I think that's where the major impact is coming from. And then we see the feedback between as we've improved our soil, that plant becomes much more efficient in terms of its photosynthetic process as well. So looking at things like that change in dynamics, that change in stand, all these different things. Like I said, we don't fully understand these interactions, and we're really trying to figure it out as quickly as possible.
Yeah, well, we might have to have you back on in the future as you guys continue to experiment with this stuff. And I might even just need to sounds like make a trip over to Wamego just down the road and see some of what you guys are doing for yourself because that sounds very for myself because that sounds very, very interesting. So
Oh yeah, we'd be glad to have you, Nick. We could give you a big tour and everything.
yeah,
So,
well, no, okay, we might have to do it. I'll talk to you once we stop recording. But Jerry, thank you again for coming on. Thank you for taking the time to share your expertise and your wisdom. And we just thank all of you for tuning into the K-State Region Ag podcast. And we will talk to you next time.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.